It has been 500 years since the fall of the Aztec Empire. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, now the city of Mexico, the Aztecs once built a colossal city. The Aztecs were renowned for their use of blood in religious rituals as well as social events. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his men arrived at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521, they described witnessing a horrific ceremony. Aztec priests, using obsidian-bladed knives sharp as razors, would carve open the chests of sacrificial victims and offer their still-beating hearts to the gods. Afterwards, they would throw the lifeless bodies of the victims down the steep steps of the towering Templo Mayor. All of this took place, but it is important to remember that for the Aztecs, the act of sacrifice, human sacrifice being just one part, was a highly ritualized process aimed at achieving the highest possible honor for the gods and was considered necessary to ensure the ongoing prosperity of humanity. The very practice of human sacrifice among the Aztecs did not originate with them as the first civilization in Mesoamerica to engage in such rituals. It is likely that the Olmec civilization, 1200–300 BCE, began such ceremonies atop their sacred pyramids. Other civilizations such as the Maya and Toltec continued this practice. However, the Aztecs took sacrifice to an unprecedented scale. In Mesoamerican culture, human sacrifice was seen as a repayment for the sacrifices that the gods themselves made in creating the world and the sun. This idea of reciprocity is particularly apt in the legend of the reptilian monster Cipactli, or Tlaltecutli. The great gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca tore this creature apart to form the earth and the sky, and all other things like mountains, rivers, and springs came from various parts of her body. To soothe Cipactli's spirit, the gods promised to appease her heart and human blood. From another perspective, sacrifice was an atonement for the sins committed by humanity in Aztec mythology. The gods were then fed and nourished by the blood and flesh of the sacrifices to ensure the balance and continual prosperity of Aztec society. Bloodletting and self-mutilation were considered non-human sacrifices. For example, blood from the ears and legs using bones or maguey thorns, and burning strips of blood-soaked paper was a common form of sacrifice, as were burning tobacco and incense. Other forms of sacrifice included offerings of live creatures, such as deer, butterflies, and snakes. In a sense, the offerings sacrificed precious objects willingly given up for the gods' enjoyment. This category includes food and valuable items made of precious metals, jade, and shells that could be buried ceremonially. The fundamental reason behind Aztec human sacrifice was survival. According to Aztec cosmology, the sun god Huitzilopochtli was engaged in an ongoing battle against darkness, and if darkness prevailed, the world would end. To keep the sun moving across the sky and preserve their lives, the Aztecs had to sustain Huitzilopochtli with human hearts and blood. It is difficult to imagine, but many soldiers, slaves, and citizens of the Aztec Empire willingly approached the sacrificial altar. Offering one's heart to Huitzilopochtli was a great honor and a ticket to a fortunate afterlife, fighting alongside the sun god's army against the forces of darkness. When Aztecs sacrificed humans to Huitzilopochtli, the victim would be placed on a sacrificial stone. Subsequently, priests would cut open the abdomen with an obsidian or flint knife. The heart would be torn out while still beating and held up to the sky to honor the sun god. The body would then be pushed down the pyramid, where the stone of Coyohauqui could be found. The Coyohauqui stone Risiris enacted the story of Coyohauqui, Huitzilopochtli's sister, who was dismembered at the foot of the mountain, similar to sacrificial victims. The body would be cremated or given to the warrior responsible for capturing the victim. He would either dismember the body and distribute the pieces as offerings, or use them for cannibalistic rituals. Thus, the warrior would rise in the Aztec social hierarchy, a system that rewarded successful warriors. Additionally, flesh was burned, or blood poured over statues of the gods, so that the gods could directly consume it. Perhaps the most quintessential example of feeding the gods was the rituals to ensure the sun god Tezcatlipoca was sufficiently nourished to awaken the sun every morning. Another source of sacrifice was ceremonial ball games, where the losing captain or even the entire team paid a heavy price for failure. Particularly, children could be sacrificed to honor the rain god Tlaloc in ceremonies held on sacred mountains. Many children were severely wounded before death, and they must have suffered greatly, as Tlaloc demanded the tears of children as part of the sacrifice. Priests made the children cry on the way to the pyre, a sign that Tlaloc would moisten the earth during the rainy season. Slaves were another social group from which sacrificial victims were chosen. They might accompany their rulers in death or be offered as gifts to ensure prosperity in trade. Among the most honored sacrificial victims were those impersonating deities. Specifically chosen individuals would dress as a specific deity before sacrifice. In the case of impersonating Tezcatlipoca in the Toxcatl ceremony, in June or May according to the Aztec calendar, the victim was treated like royalty for a year preceding the sacrifice, taught by priests, given a female attendant, and honored with dances and flowers. The victim was the embodiment of the deity on earth until the final brutal moment, when they met their creator. Perhaps even worse off were those impersonating Cipitotec, who at the peak of the Tlacaxipehualisle festival were skinned alive to honor the god known as the Flayedwana. Human sacrifice also served another purpose in the expanding Aztec Empire of the 15th and 16th centuries: intimidation. The ritualistic killing of war captives and the display of their heads on a large scale were visual reminders of the empire's power and the extent of its dominion. DNA analysis of victims found at the Templo Mayor site indicates that the majority of those sacrificed were outsiders, likely soldiers or slaves of enemies. The nature of warfare during the Aztec Empire's peak of power was also quite unique. By the late 15th century, the Aztecs had gained control over vast territories in central and southern Mexico. The only remaining holdout was the city-state of Tlaxcala to the east. With human sacrifice, victims were often selected from captive warriors. Indeed, warfare was often conducted solely for the purpose of providing candidates for sacrifice. This was referred to as flowery war, Xochiayoyutl, where indecisive skirmishes resulted from the Aztecs being content with capturing just enough prisoners for sacrifice, and the eastern Tlaxcala region was a favored hunting ground. The bravest or most handsome fighters were considered the most worthy candidates for sacrifice and were more likely to appease the gods. Indeed, human sacrifice reserved for the most deserving victims was seen as a high honor, a direct communion with the divine. In addition to cutting out the hearts of victims and pouring their blood onto altars and temples, it is believed that the Aztecs also practiced a form of cannibalistic ritual. The bodies of victims, after being decapitated, might be gifted to nobles and other prominent members of the community. Illustrations from the 16th century depict body parts being cooked in large pots, and archaeologists have identified butcher marks on human skeletal remains at Aztec sites around the city of Mexico. While it has long been hypothesized that the Aztecs only engaged in cannibalism during times of famine, another explanation is that consuming the flesh of a person offered to the gods was akin to communing with the deities themselves. Though it may sound unsettling, Verano suggests that cannibalistic rituals likely existed among the Aztecs and were regarded not only as normal, but also as a great honor. Ritual took place at dedicated temples atop large pyramids, such as those in Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, where sacrifice was often conducted by pulling the victim onto a special stone, cutting open their chest, and extracting the heart with obsidian or volcanic glass knives. The most common form of human sacrifice was heart extraction. Subsequently, the heart was placed in a stone vessel called Quauxicalli, or in a shakmul, a sculpted stone figure with a receptacle at its abdomen, and burned as an offering to the sacrificed deity. Additionally, victims might be decapitated or dismembered. This method was often reserved for female victims impersonating deities like Chalchiuhtlicue, although depictions from various Spanish codices show decapitated bodies being thrown down the steps of the pyramid. Those sacrificed to Jeptotec were also skinned, likely to mimic the shedding of seeds. Prior to the ceremonies, there were rules for the chosen ones, such as fasting for 4 or multiples of 4 days before each ceremony, with 1 unseasoned meal of chili or salt each day. Abstinence from sexual relations, bathing, etc. was also observed. Each ceremony required offerings of incense, food, flowers, paper, clothing adorned with rubber beads, as well as burning of incense and pouring of wine. The rituals themselves included feasting, dancing, processions, and singing ceremonial songs accompanied by music from drums, rattles, flutes, whistlers, and conch shells. Victims might also be sacrificed in a more elaborate procedure, where a single victim was required to engage in a gladiatorial contendere garmonet team for förfånlis verlechkeit warriors. Narrowly, the vect had no chance of surviving this challenge or inflicting any injuries on opponents, as he was not only bound to the stone bench to Malagatl, but his weapon was typically a feathered club, while his opponents wielded obsidian-bladed swords. In another method, victims might be tied to frames and shot with arrows or darts. And perhaps the worst method, victims were continuously thrown into a fire pit and then had their hearts cut out. Priests would bring the bodies to another ritual space where they would lay them face up. With years of practice, detailed anatomical knowledge, and knives sharper than surgical steel, they would slit a thin gap between the 2 vertebrae at the neck, expertly severing the body's head. Using razor-sharp blades, the priests skillfully skinned the face and muscles, turning it into a skull box. They would then drill large holes on both sides of the skull box and place it on a thick wooden pole to hold other skull boxes prepared in a similar manner. These skull racks were attached to the Tzompantli of Tenochtitlan, a giant head rack erected in front of the Templo Mayor, a pyramid with 2 temples on top. One was dedicated to the god of war, Huitzilopochtli, and the other to the rain god, Tlaloc. Finally, after many months or years exposed to sun and rain, the skull boxes would start to crack into pieces, lose teeth, and perhaps even the jaw. The priests would remove it to make a mask and place it in offerings or use mortar to add it to the 2 skull towers on both sides of the Tzompantli. For the Aztecs, a larger cultural group to which the Mexica belonged, these skull boxes were seeds ensuring the continuous existence of humanity. They were symbols of life and rebirth, much like the first flowers of spring. Other types of human sacrifices were performed to express reverence for different deities and involved killing victims in various ways. Victims might be shot with arrows, killed in combat in a gladiatorial style, sacrificed in Mesoamerican ballgame matches, burned, skinned post-sacrifice, or drowned. Individuals unable to fulfill their ritual duties would be dealt with in a much less honorable manner. This offending the gods needed to be atoned for, so the sacrificial offering would be killed while being punished instead of being honored. For the Aztecs, human sacrifice was a normal way to show respect to the divine. However, this practice is now seen as a gruesome ritual, resulting in the loss of hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Thank you for listening. What do you think about the Aztec stories? Please comment below and let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to support me. See you in the next videos.